Welcome to A Healthy Bite. You're one nibble closer to a more satisfying way of life, a healthier you, and bite-sized bits of healthy motivation. Now let's dig in on the dish with Rebecca Huff.
Hey, it's Rebecca, and today I am here with author and Dr. Cynthia Lee, and we are discussing her new book, Brave New Medicine, and it's called A Doctor's Unconventional Path to Healing Her Autoimmune Illness. And I have to tell you, I was sucked into your book from the first line. It's not just like from a medical standpoint, it's really your personal experience, right?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, people always ask me, like, exactly what do you do? What kind of doctor are you? And I start by saying, I'm a human being first. And I don't even like the labels of integrative or functional medicine doctor or conventional or internal medicine doctor. I just say, I'm a doctor really seeking out the most tools that I can have to help support my patients in their healing journeys. So absolutely, this book is really about the paradigm shift that I broke open to, like how I was trained in a very mainstream medical center, which I still deeply, deeply hold in great esteem. But sort of how the lived experience of illness is very different than how we're trained, with very, very controlled studies and trials and very black and white frameworks of how to diagnose disease and how to treat. So, but it was through my own experience of having autoimmune and really complex conditions. And had there been a magic bullet for my conditions, I would, I wouldn't have wished this journey on anybody. But had there been an easy way out or an easy way to cope, I probably would still be using that method.
Right. Well, I mean, in the opening of your book, I'm glad that you said what you said just now, because I was like, is this a spoiler if I ask her this question? But you already mentioned that you had this autoimmune disease, and it is on the cover of the book. But in the opening, you tell a story, and then you kind of pose this question: if the tests are normal, does disease exist? And I was like, oh my goodness. As I was reading it, and then you're talking about how you were on stage and you were giving this presentation and you were talking about this woman, and she had all of these symptoms, and it was one of your patients, and she had all these test results. And of course, they were normal and this and that. And then you talk about it, and then you tell who the patient is. Can you tell me a little bit about this patient?
Yeah. So this patient that I presented as a difficult patient, these patients that I, as a doctor, had really come to dread, partly because I had no tools to offer them. And they kept coming back with worsening symptoms, but their screening tests were normal. And also difficult because, they have increasing, rightly so, anxiety and grief, and they're really looking for a solution. And these are the patients that, I feel also like an emotional and sort of existential weight in confronting. So I was feeling increasingly frustrated at this difficult patient, and I really revealed that this patient was me. And I was giving this it was a grand rounds presentation to a hospital-wide doctors luncheon. And, and when I said that, it was very much like you could hear a pin drop.
I bet.
It was, because first of all, it was very unexpected. And secondly, we don't talk, we as doctors there's sort of this unspoken taboo that you don't really disclose anything personal. Especially if you haven't it's not something that you could conquer and become the world's expert on. And when I was giving this grand rounds, I was still very much, I remember the morning of, I wasn't quite sure I could do it because my symptoms were kind of kicking up. And so I was still very much in the middle of my health journey. So at the same time, it was one of the most terrifying things I had done, but it was also very liberating. And it ended up being one of the pivotal points of just healing, because I realized I had let go of some shame that I had been holding back. So to actually go into the places that scare me and moving through it became sort of one of the guiding principles I followed to go deeper into my own closet, so to speak, and releasing the skeletons and facing them. Yeah.
You talk a lot about that. The story that you write, this book is I felt like it was very personal. I felt like I knew you as I was reading it, and you share some tragic things that happened to you in your life, and some things that, you had to grieve and get through. And then you share about your illness. And I think it gave me cold chills when I read some parts of it, but I think it's because I know what it's like to be the patient. And I've always thought it would be fascinating to talk to a doctor who understood what it's like to be that patient. And you keep saying, there's clearly something wrong with me. I know this test result doesn't show that there's anything. I know that there's something wrong with me. I've experienced it. My oldest daughter has experienced it. I actually have a Facebook group full of women who have varying chronic illnesses, but it's called Hope Lively. And it's a support group for women. And it's just to help them keep the hope, because so many times when we don't get that diagnosis after seeing doctor after doctor after doctor, and I don't know if you experience this, but I think a lot of us, not being doctors, we're like, maybe it is in my head, but I feel it feels real. I have the symptom, I can see it. But at some point, a lot of us are told that these are psychosomatic symptoms. And I've always wanted to ask a doctor what that's like to see these normal test results. And did you ever start to wonder, is this all in my head? Is there something? What was that like?
Absolutely. I mean, I knew what I was experiencing, but at the same time, it didn't fit into my paradigm. It didn't fit into my worldview. And, when I started getting the initial symptoms, I was a new mother. I was about 3 years out of residency. So I was at this place in my work life where I had a sense of mastery. I knew the cutting edge studies just pat, I knew the drills. I knew, I felt very confident at my game, if we want to call it that. And so when I began to have these symptoms that didn't fit and my tests were normal, of course, I went straight to questioning myself. Okay, wait a minute. This must be all in my head. So I thought it was a lot of motherhood. It happened at such a similar time as being a new mother. I thought initially it was postpartum stuff, and then after the postpartum period was over, I thought it was, I was diagnosed then with a thyroid condition, but the autoimmune thyroid condition resolved by numbers, but not by symptoms. So I had thought, even as my symptoms persisted, insomnia, exhaustion, and a lot of palpitations, dizziness, but I was still very I lived a very full life. I was very functional. I was used to pushing through, not complaining. And my numbers were normal, and I considered myself cured. So that tells you a lot about where I was. Like, okay, I must be cured, and maybe these symptoms will just take some time to resolve. But they didn't resolve. And so after a trip to Beijing to visit my family, there was a very dramatic incident that then tipped me over into chronic fatigue syndrome and another condition called dysautonomia, which is just a long fancy word for a complete dysfunction of the autonomic nervous system, which is the branch that controls largely unconscious but very vital bodily functions like blood pressure, heart rate, digestion, body temperature. I mean, sort of the things that we really don't even know our body is doing until it crashes. And so this left me in a state of perpetual vertigo. My heart rate would shoot up into the 160s, 180s with me just sitting at rest. I always felt like I was on the verge of passing out. A lot of people with these conditions pass out regularly. So it was a very anxiety producing state to be in. And the exhaustion was really profound as well. So for 2 years, I was largely housebound. And it took about 2 years for me to break out of my paradigm. I mean, that's how deeply entrenched I was in it. And I put all my faith in it. So it was during this 2-year period that I had gone from specialist to specialist and found no answers, but I was really baffling myself. And what happened to me is something that I have seen, just reflected in the eyes of my patients, is this sense of learned helplessness, sort of, deepening helplessness with each sort of punt, right, by a specialist. And so I referred myself to a psychiatrist. I mean, I knew that this was where doctors sent patients, when we had no answers, but I think they were merciful on me because I was a doctor, and she's a doctor, she must be sane. We know she's not making it up.
Right.
But I wanted to know, and there was part of me that wanted the diagnosis of depression or anxiety so that I could hang my hat on it. It was better than having no diagnosis and having no name. But, I left the psychiatrist's office and she said, "You don't have a psychiatric condition. I think it's hormonal. You go back to your endocrinologist." And so I laughed. Just, there was, it was a merry-go-round and there was nowhere to go. We weren't going anywhere. So I knew I had to get off, but it was not without a lot of resistance. And I literally was just too tired to continue.
Oh, yes. I mean, I've been there. I mean, some of the diagnoses that, for example, I have Epstein-Barr virus. And so that in itself makes you very tired. I've tested positive for mold allergies. I've tested positive for Lyme. I mean, so there's like all these things. And then my older daughter started going through some of the things that you just explained. She would start feeling just like shaking all over, and she had all these unexplained symptoms, and she went from doctor to doctor to doctor, and she's still pursuing a diagnosis. But it is very interesting to me to hear it from your perspective, because I mean, even you started to doubt yourself at some point. So that makes me feel better, because I think a lot of us women do wonder, am I depressed? Is this in my head? And so we begin to question ourselves. But what are some of the signs? Now, I know you have written extensively about just how to, stay healthy and how to keep the toxins out of your home and all that. But first, I wanted you to kind of tell, for people that maybe aren't sure, what are some of the signs that you may have an autoimmune disease, or this, you called it dysautonomia. What are some of the symptoms that we maybe could know, maybe it isn't depression, maybe there really is something wrong with me?
Yeah, let me just backtrack a little bit before I answer that question. Is the search for a diagnosis can sometimes just really turn into the search for the Holy Grail. I mean, and it's not a Holy Grail. So even if we find the diagnosis, it can be really disappointing.
Right.
I diagnosed myself in my bathroom when I couldn't stand up without my blood pressure, dropping, with chronic fatigue syndrome and dysautonomia. And it actually made me more despairing, because number one, there's no good treatment. It's number two, those are very poorly understood conditions, if the doctor even believes that they're, quote, real. And three, the prognoses for these conditions are depressing. Mm-hmm. So to identify with those diagnoses was very risky in my eyes, because it could really kill any hope that I had of recovery. So I actually chose to not even like it's nowhere in my medical records that I have those things.
I think that's
And
kind of what my daughter did too. Eventually she was like, you know what, I'm just going to start living a healthy lifestyle and
yeah.
doing all of the things that I can. I don't need a doctor to tell me what I have so that I can move forward. But for a
Right.
while you feel like you have to label it.
Right. And that's because of the way first of all, that our medical system works, but also our culture. I mean, I think it's, we feel if we have a name, right, it gives some kind of validity
Oh yeah.
to what's going on. If we can, right, if there's a form to it, it's not just this formless sort of nebulous experience. And the big turning point for me was actually going back into basics. Like I had nowhere to go. No specialist was going to fix me. And I went back to basics, went into my pathology textbook, and I was reviewing, what's happening at the cellular level, like what's happening in my body. And that's when I learned that diseases are not black and white. Like they're not defined by a set of criteria. They're not defined by a blood test or another diagnostic test. The state of health and disease is really a continuous spectrum. And we know now from data that's been published that diseases often happen years and sometimes decades before a diagnosis can be made. So that was a game changer for me, because I realized, you know what? The common denominator for all chronic diseases is inflammation, regardless of what's causing it. And if I could address inflammation, then it doesn't matter what name I give it. I'm just going to be addressing how do I reduce inflammation in my body, whether it is autoimmune, like sort of the immune system is creating antibodies against my own tissues. The inflammation damages the cells. If our bodies can't keep up with that sort of, processing what's damaged and trying to repair it, then eventually a diagnosable disease occurs. So back to your question about symptoms, I mean, a lot of the symptoms of autoimmunity are common symptoms of a lot of other chronic conditions. So it's, it's vague things like fatigue or brain fog. I'm not, quite losing my memory, but I'm not sharp. I can't recall things as quickly. I flip numbers, I flip phrases, common phrases that I might use. So those are examples: stiffness, generalized stiffness, and I feel a little bit achy. A common thing I had when I was fully functional and quote healthy, like I remember in residency, after these crazy 36-hour call shifts, I would feel dizzy. I mean, like really dizzy, and I would feel lightheaded, and my muscles were really sore. Like I had kind of run a marathon. And, in hindsight, after learning what I learned, I realized, my God, my hormone systems, my immune system, my neurological system, like they were already imbalanced. I just assumed everyone else felt that way. I mean, because like, who wouldn't feel like they ran a marathon after a 36-hour shift?
Right.
But then my colleagues actually didn't experience that. So I think what we tend to do is, because nobody likes, a whiner, and nobody, it's a very much what doesn't kill you makes you stronger culture. We tend to minimize that and normalize it. So, I think it's just normal.
Right.
Yeah. So we come to accept a state of suboptimal health as normal. And I see that also with aging, right? We sort of just associate getting older with aches and pains and, all sorts of other slowly malfunctioning parts of our body, and say, well, wait a minute, no, that's actually not what could happen, right? And probably what ought to happen. So let's begin to uncouple these associations that we have and really demand and give ourselves the chance for optimal health.
Yeah, you were talking about focusing and swapping the words in your mind or whatever. That happens. And sometimes I would do the same thing. I'm like, is this part of being, having these things that are going on in my body? Or is this because I'm getting older? Or is this because I have too many things on my plate? But I will do that. And my kids will point it out to me that sometimes I'll say, can you go in there and get that? And then the word's just not there. Like, I know what I want them to go get, but the word just doesn't come to me. So, and I think that is something that a lot of us with chronic illness tend to, we want to think, okay, well, that's just because I'm getting older, or it's just because I have so much going on. But I do think a lot of it goes back to the illness, because for me, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think a lot of times when I'm not taking as good of care of myself, so maybe I'm not doing turmeric, I'm not doing some of the other supplements, like I do a lot of lauricidin and things like that, maybe just slacking off of taking care of myself, then I feel like I struggle with it a little bit more. So maybe it's not, I don't know, but I think a lot of times we're trying to pinpoint it, really, whether it's too many things on our plate. It all kind of goes back to self-care, whether it's too many things on our plate or if it actually is the illness that's causing these symptoms. Bottom line, we still need to take better care of ourselves and do the
Right.
things that we know we're supposed to do.
Absolutely. And I mean, to your point, we put significant demands on our minds and our bodies, and the multitasking and the digital age, and boom, 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 boom. I mean, you've got 6 kids, I've got 2, and a very active husband, and it's really, really challenging. So regardless, so I said, part of it is, how do we slow down? How do we internally, right, sort of remember and connect to our bodies, remembering that our bodies still abide by the laws of nature. We are not meant to be operating at this digital pace, and recognizing that instead of fighting it. I remember, a lot of times when I had symptoms, I felt like my body betrayed me. My body betrayed me, as if my body is some kind of vehicle that just carries my spirit and my mind wherever they want to go, and they have no boundaries. So it's really about, wait a minute, who's betraying who, and my body is me. So really beginning to integrate the sense of body, mind, and spirit, and recognizing also that the body is basically where the subconscious can be accessed. I mean, we store within our cells, within the way our DNA is folded, a huge amount of the subconscious. So the symptom of let's just call it brain fog, right, or forgetfulness, whether it is some mineral imbalance, whether it is an omega-3 deficiency, whether it is an autoimmune flare, whatever, an allergen in foods, to doing too much, whatever it is, it's a mismatch. And the symptoms are really our body's way of telling us, whoa, wait a minute, something is not working and something's got to change, or else I will change it. I will demand a change at some point, right? Depending on how we listen or don't listen. Mm-hmm. And so it's really up to us. I mean, that's the hard part of healing. In the old not the old paradigm, but in the way that I was trained, right? Sort of in the mainstream paradigm, 15, 20 minutes per patient, we come to both expect on the doctor and the patient side just kind of a quick solution, right? We want to, what can I walk away with now, today? Mm-hmm. A prescription that's going to help me feel better. And we need to get away from that and see it as a partnership. So I always tell my patients, like, you are the captain of your ship, and you are your ship, and I'm going to help you navigate. So, all right, you know what? You're forgetting things, or you're scrambling words. I'm going to do some investigating on my part, but then what are you going to do on your part, right? You're the one living your life. And, and it's not, it's very rarely as simple as, oh, you know what, you got to remove gluten and then everything is fine. Oh, you know what, you're magnesium deficient. Oh, and everything is fine. It's usually it's a full catastrophe living sort of
Right.
approach. And the sooner we can embrace that notion of health as being just a way of living rather than a quick prescription, I think the easier the path ahead for everybody.
I love that. And along with that, I think one key thing that a lot of people overlook is how important it is to get sleep. So many people skip out on sleep and then wonder why their brain isn't working properly. And I'm like, you really can't function unless you get enough sleep. But I think that's one factor that a lot of people tend to overlook. And I know you talked a bit about insomnia. But I had written down another quote from your book that I wanted to talk to you about that I really loved and highlighted. Oh, you said, the simplest step in healing is also the hardest, believing it is possible. And then you talk about the process, how it often happens with chronic disease when the illness becomes your identity and when it becomes all encompassing. And then you go on, I'm not going to read the whole thing because I hope that everyone goes out and reads this book because it is life-changing. But you go on and you say, this isn't positive thinking. It's physiology at its best. By addressing root causes, reducing inflammation, restoring imbalances, and connecting to something greater beyond us, healing happens as a side effect. I loved that. Can you expound on that a little bit?
Yeah, and there are a lot of pieces there. It's been something I've been really reflecting on as a doctor as well, because going back to what we were talking about, a diagnosis, the way that we're trained with drugs and procedures, everything does hinge on the diagnosis, right? So the protocols reflect that once you have a diagnosis, then you have A, B, or C protocol to follow. Without it, we look for some causes, but we haven't really been trained to look at, more fine-tuned deficiencies or stealth infections or hidden allergens in the way that I learned in integrative and functional medicine. So, but what happens with the diagnosis, it's sort of like labeling a child a C student. Okay, it might be useful in terms of measuring if we're looking at large populations and following trends and having some sort of standard, but what happens to that student on the individual level? And as a doctor, what am I doing when I actually diagnose a patient with something, right? Something like chronic fatigue syndrome, something like autoimmune thyroid condition. Often, well, one of the first things that people do is they get online and they start researching. And it is, first of all, there's so much stuff out there and it's a mixed bag, but what patients really want to know is what am I likely to expect and what is my prognosis? And a lot of those numbers and the information that's out there is not encouraging. So we begin to identify with a state of chronic unwellness, even if we are living our lives, but it's like this identity that is now sort of hanging over our psyches as we live our lives. And so I watch a lot. I mean, I still have to diagnose for, billing purposes, for documenting my notes, and just as a way of communicating with patients. But I'm very careful about the language. even the more testing that we do, more and more testing, we're reinforcing the notion that they're not well. So I've become over the years a lot more selective. Like, okay, what do I really need to look for? What do I not need to look for? What do they actually need to do stepwise that's going to be empowering to them, as opposed to diminishing sort of their sense of their capacity for wellness. And so it's a very, very nuanced line, but it's something that that I was so aware of, that I became much more aware of when I started writing. When I started writing, I had never had an intention to publish, and I had always kept a journal, and I thought, you know what, why don't I just, and I've always loved reading, so why don't I just start writing? And it allowed me to step outside of my identity of someone who was sick. You know, I was writing about myself, and even though I was writing in the first person, I had to get outside of myself, and I had to actually start thinking, for example, about my husband, right? What was he doing when I was like in misery and like, you know, wanting to just detach from my life and sort of disappear? What was he doing? Oh my God, you know, he was holding the family together, right? We had 2 young kids, and he was working, and he was, so I didn't quite realize how insidious and how strong the identification of me being ill, and ill with conditions that had really bad prognoses, and how that was affecting me. So the writing itself was very therapeutic. It was hard to go into the harder times, but it was incredibly therapeutic. You know, this was another way of opening that closet and kind of confronting the skeletons and realizing, oh, you know what, they're actually not so scary. And I've been carrying around all this shame. I'm a doctor who has conditions I can't even figure out. And just let them out, you know, give them some sunlight, and they're not so scary anymore. And then suddenly, you know, like I have a little bit less inflammation in my body. I mean, the not just the neurons in my brain and my body are changing the way they're connecting, but the way my DNA is expressing itself is, has shifted. So one of the things that I learned about belief also was, you know, and I think belief is one of those threads that has been with me since I was young. And I had grown up in an evangelical community in Texas, and this dualistic notion of heaven and hell really plagued me. You know, how can some people be, quote, chosen, and others are just going to, the vast majority of the world is just going to go to hell? And I remember as a child being terrified that I was going to be one of those left behind, that I didn't believe the way that other people in my family and in my church believed. And I was terrified. How do you make yourself believe something that you don't? And so that same question plagued me when I was very, very unwell. Like, how do I make myself believe something when I don't believe it? Number one, by the numbers that I see, and number two, by my experience. You know, I've been in this misery for years, and I'm supposed to believe really that I'm gonna be well. And so it wasn't until I really began the practice of Qigong, which is a moving meditation, and really integrating mind, body, spirit. And it's using not just movements, very gentle movements like Tai Chi, but consciousness, so awareness building, and also sounds. So there's like sound vibrations that are very healing, literally in how they, you know, the body responds to the vibrations. And, but it was through that I realized, oh, wow, you know what? I don't actually have to believe. Belief is something my left brain is going to do. It's an analytical thing. Does it make sense to me or not? And the right brain, and when you're really expanding consciousness and intuition, really drops into this realm of visualization. So I had the capacity to visualize myself fully healthy, even if my left brain didn't believe it. And that was really powerful. And I remember the very first time I visualized it and brought that visualization into my body. You know, what would it feel like if I were climbing a mountain and I was at the top, and I was visualizing myself spinning around because I was really feeling strong, and it triggered vertigo in me. I mean, I had to
Oh,
brace myself and, you know, whoa, but it was, it reinforced the fact of how potent that was, that my visualization actually triggered vertigo.
wow.
And I thought, wow, if it can do that, I can start working with that. So I really began working with it, and it's hard work, but it's significantly easier than making my skeptical, other, you know, mind believe that it's possible.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, I have never been good at the power of positive thinking.
Mm.
And since you are familiar with the evangelical side of things, you've probably heard the name it and claim it kind of things. So I never was very good at that, but I did have a doctor. Something that you said before kind of triggered this memory. I had a doctor in Lakeland, Florida. He's long since retired, Dr. Robinson. He always made me believe I was well just by the way he talked to me. I
Mhm.
mean, obviously, you know, he would do tests and stuff, but he always was like, your body, you know, I mean, I don't know, something about the way he talks to me would always make me believe that I was going to be okay. And I had on the opposite side a doctor, because I traveled to Florida to see this doctor. I had one doctor who would do like an EKG, and oh, he would start freaking out. Oh, I've got to call the nurses in here and we've got to talk to you. You have your EKG isn't normal. You have inverted T waves. And then I'm like convinced I'm going to have a heart attack right on the spot. And then I go see this doctor in Florida, and he's like, you just had a baby, you have hormones. These inverted T waves often happen with progesterone, you know, fluctuations. And so he completely soothed me. Nothing changed for my physical self, but suddenly I felt healthier. And so I do
Yes.
think that belief has a lot to do with it. And my number 5 child, when he was born at home, he was 12 pounds. And so I went through this like crazy, crunchy phase of my life where I was a raw vegan and I was doing all these things. And so I didn't have an ultrasound with him, and I was just going to have my midwife. And I didn't know that he was 12 pounds, but miraculously, my body was able to handle it. And yeah, I mean, so I think during the time that I was pregnant with him, I did a lot of what you just described. Is I pictured myself, um, you know, just being healthy and giving birth to this healthy baby. And so it really helped me, because I honestly don't know if I could have gotten through this. Giving birth to a 12-pound baby at home is not advisable. I don't recommend it.
That's incredible.
Go to the hospital if you're going to have a 12-pound baby. But I survived it, and I healed and everything. But yeah, I do believe completely in the power of your the mind and just the whole mind body connection. And on the flip side, I do believe that when you're filled with bitterness and resentment and anger and all of these things, that it can also affect your body negatively. So
Absolutely.
of course, if you can affect it negatively, then there's also the positive side. So I think
Right. Right. And I mean that particular challenge comes up, like a lot of people raise questions about that. Like how do you get from a place of complete despair, which is where I was for quite a long time, to these characteristics of resilient people, you know, that you're bringing up, right? Optimism, calm, sort of this inner confidence, unshakable, sort of steadfast confidence. And I would say that, well, first of all, you know, my husband is one of those people, and I had a really hard time being around him. You know, so it felt, I've never had migraines before, but the analogy that I would give is, you know, it felt like someone who has a migraine who can't tolerate the sun, right, or any kind of light. For where I was and how overly sensitive I was to any kind of stimuli, and how miserable I felt, I could not be around his energy or people like that.
Wow.
And how do you get from, where I was to where he is? Um, and it's also annoying. I mean, it's aggravating for people to say, "Oh, well, you got to be more positive, and you got to have, you can't give up hope." And so I sort of got there through the back door. I mean, yeah, I was doing Qigong, and I was doing a lot of, visualizations and such. But the way I would say I really got to the other side of helplessness, to feeling empowered, was it was through the back door, by releasing. So instead of trying to attain a certain state, I just started releasing crap. And again, not by some enlightened measure. It was because I was too fatigued. It takes a lot of energy to hold on to fears. And,
Mm-hmm.
I just got to the place where I was too tired. So, all right, okay, I got to talk to my mom, right? My parents came to support us. They lived in Beijing. They came to support us at the drop of a hat when I asked. But I had a lot of stuff I needed to confront with my mother, just about childhood stuff. And who wants to go there? But you know what? I had no energy. And there she was, right in my house. And okay, Mom, can we talk about, some of the stuff in my childhood that I remember, and not to blame, but just so that you can acknowledge that, some of it was hard for me. And I had these conversations with my mother that I never imagined having. And I attended a grief ritual, which I write about too. And I ended up attending a couple of more after that. But I had no idea what to do with grief. And, I had a tremendous loss during my medical school years, right? When my partner died. And
Is that the ring that you're wearing on your necklace? I wondered if you were still wearing it because I read about that in your book. Is that?
No, I don't. I don't actually have that ring anymore. We ended up, kind of releasing it into the world.
Oh,
But it actually got replaced by a ring given to me by one of my mentors.
oh,
So but in the grief ritual, I learned so much, and I learned about how the reason why we fear grief is, well, first of all, nobody likes to go there. But our culture is very obsessed with, being in the light and being peppy and being enthusiastic, and again, not being a downer. And yet grief is just a part of love. It's a part of being human. And our ancestors used to do these regular soul detoxes. And so we're walking around with a bunch of grief, and we fear it because we fear that if we go there, we're going to go into despair. But it's not the grief that's the problem, it's that we've privatized it. So we grieve privately, and yeah, nobody's around supporting us, we're going to risk despair. So how do we release in a healthy manner where we feel supported? And which really has made me reflect about doctors, because we're confronting people with their greatest fears, with their deepest griefs. And what we're given is generally two choices. We either empathize and we carry their grief, or we detach, right? So if we carry too much grief and we're not taught how to process it and to release it, it's going to make us sick. It's going to make us more burned out. If we detach, we're coping, we're functioning, but it also leads to burnout, because when we detach from our patients, we're also detaching from our own humanity. We're detaching from ourselves. So both ways lead to burnout. And everyone's talking about physician burnout. And, oh, how do we, give them more time for leisure and more time for, balance with their family, and, and these other measures. How do we reduce administrative duties? But I feel like nobody's talking about the elephant in the exam room, which is this grief. So, and that's one of the areas that I've been focusing on with doctors in large medical centers. Is this is something we have to begin to talk about. So through my journey, it was really releasing more and more stuff. And when I released the stuff, there was just more spaciousness. And so things like gratitude and, gentleness and optimism, those things sort of filled it naturally.
Mm-hmm.
So it became a side effect rather than something I was trying to attain, because you can't sort of attain those things.
Right. It's not something you can actually work for.
Right. You can't work for it and obtain it in an authentic manner, because then you're cramming in more stuff. Right. It's more like, I should do this, I should do that, which is the antithesis of healing.
Right. And my therapist says we're not allowed to should on each other. So not allowed to should on yourself either. So she'll say, stop shoulding on me.
Yeah.
That's good. Well, I just think you have such a good perspective on this, and you're in such a position that I feel like it's so wonderful because you have both sides of this perspective from a doctor and as a patient. And so I just thank you so much for sharing with us, for writing this book from such a personal place. And, as you talked about the grief and just about the things that you went through in your childhood and how you struggled to even share those with your mom because you knew what she had gone through. I think so many of us can relate to that. And I think your book is going to help a lot of people. And I just thank you so much for writing it, for being on my show.
Thank you. And just, I want to close with, Carl Jung. So, Carl Jung very famously said that our capacity to heal others is directly related to our own self-examination. And so it's, I really see it as a call to doctors and patients, really human beings to continue self-examination, self-awareness. And we're never done learning. Learning is really, when we stop changing, we stop being alive. And how can we venture on into this new era of healing and medicine in a partnership that doesn't, blame one side or another? So that's really my hope. And
that's my hope too.
Yeah, it's been a real pleasure.
Yes, words of wisdom. Thank you so much. I really do appreciate it. And I'll make sure that all of the links for your book, and you have a website, correct?
Yes, it's CynthiaLeeMD.com and CYNTHIA, Lee is spelled LIMD.com.
Okay, I'll make sure all of the links are in the show notes. So make sure that if you're listening to this, you go and check out the show notes so you can find all of the goods. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Please rate and review so other people can learn about this podcast. Find out more about sleep, hygiene, eating healthy, tasty recipes, zero-waste lifestyle, and lots more on ThatOrganicMom.com. Help us spread the word. Be blessed and stay healthy.